A shout out to some new listeners to the podcast from the Great Midwest, Shelley from Indianapolis and Danny from Fargo, North Dakota. It's been an interesting few weeks to say the least. As you may know from previous episodes, I'm a public relations consultant. Since the start of the COVID-19 outbreak, I've been busy helping clients deal with the many unexpected challenges this situation has presented. One of my clients is a hospital that's on the front lines of this pandemic. If there's a silver lining of this experience for me, it's having the opportunity to work with so many good people who just want to help their community be safe. Another silver lining for me personally is having the chance to help in some way through better communication. Today's episode combines my love for communication with something that anyone who has worked in an office has experienced: business casual dress. I'd like to thank our guest today, Rick Miller, for taking the time, not only to talk about business casual, but to spend some time talking about the fundamentals of communication. I think you'll enjoy listening to Rick. After you listen, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send an email to tim@shapingopinion.com. If it's easier for you, get in touch on Twitter or Instagram @shapingopinion. If you want, we can give you a shout out. And as always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Rick, how often do you find yourself wearing a suit for business today?
Probably once every couple of months. And the only time I actually wear a suit with a tie is if I'm going to a formal occasion. Right now, I don't go to a single business meeting where I feel compelled to have to wear a suit and a tie. And in fact, almost all of my clients in every business setting, with the exception of perhaps some senior level hospital personnel and politicians, are wearing some form of business casual today.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Rick Miller. He's a fellow public relations veteran, and he played a role in the creation of something that has changed the way we dress for work. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. In this episode, we'll talk with Rick about the origin story of something we now call business casual, and how he helped convince America to take off that suit. Depending on your age, you may not remember a time where wearing suits to work was a requirement for most men. And for women, it was almost mandatory that they wear a skirt and heels to the office. That all started to change in a big way in California in the early 1990s. But the birth of business casual can be traced further back, to the 1960s and Hawaii. In the 1960s, Bill Foster was the president of the Hawaiian Fashion Guild. The guild was trying to figure out a way to sell more of those iconic and colorful Aloha shirts to Hawaiian residents and not just tourists. So they launched a campaign called Operation Liberation. The project provided 2 Aloha shirts to every member of the Hawaii House of Representatives and the Hawaii Senate. The goal of the campaign was to get politicians to allow government workers to wear seasonal shirts to beat the summer heat, support the state's garment industry, and make a fashion statement for the state's tourism industry. By 1966, the custom was dubbed Aloha Friday because Fridays became the day when it was socially acceptable to wear that Aloha shirt to work. Meanwhile, around the same time on the mainland in California, one of the anchor companies of Silicon Valley had its own fashion ideas. Hewlett-Packard says it was the first to introduce casual attire to the workplace. The company called its Fridays its Blue Sky Days, and it didn't stop with just shirts. Bill Hewlett and David Packard were the founders of Hewlett-Packard, and they wanted people in their company to start to think out of the box and be more creative. So they got behind the idea of letting employees dress more casually on Fridays, and they encouraged them to think differently about their approach to business solutions. Before long, the idea spread throughout Silicon Valley. Fast forward to 1992, and an idea that was hatched at a brand Levi's had recently acquired. That brand was Dockers. Rick Miller was on the PR team that worked for Dockers at the time, and he remembers how business casual became a real thing in America, and not just for Fridays.
It's an interesting story in terms of how it evolved, but it's a classic case in influencer marketing, a term that we really didn't use then, but certainly do now. And the backstory is that as certain groups of Americans began to age, they no longer fit into their traditional 501 genes, if you will. And what the folks at Levi Strauss had found is that many people were beginning to switch to the Dockers apparel line, which actually originated in Japan. And the interesting thing that began to evolve with, and I give 100% of the credit to this to the folks in the marketing queue at Levi Strauss, including a gentleman named Dan Chu, who was head of public relations at that time, was that, hey, if we could convince more Americans to wear Dockers to work, perhaps we have a way of ramping and accelerating our overall business. So as we looked at the different options to begin to do that, one of the things that we found during that period of time, and America was going through a bit of a recession at that point in the early 90s, was that some firms were beginning to adopt a once a month or a once a year program in which they would reward employees who had contributed, say, to a United Way fund or to some other charity by allowing them to wear casual dress to work. Two things came out of that. Number one is the thought that, gee, if they allow them to do it once a month or once a quarter or once a year, why not every day? And the second part of that was we found through doing some focus group and other research that companies struggled with the need to identify what is casual dress, what does it look like, and how can we define it so that we didn't have individuals show up in show up in sleeveless shirts or show up in bad shorts or whatever it might be. So they were looking for help to kind of define what that look was that would be both professional and sharp, and yet allow a new level of comfort and appearance for both men and women in the workplace. Well, when we had found that companies were looking for help in defining for their employees what was acceptable to wear for casual business and what are the looks that made sense, we found men in particular at that point had wardrobes that were thin, had ill-fitting clothes, and really didn't have anything to fill that gap to wear to work that allowed them to be both comfortable and have a presentable appearance. So the Guide to Casual Business Wear was born that showed a range of looks that not only matched Dockers with, say, a button-down or a casual shirt that could even be a polo, but also Levi's jeans that you might match with a sport jacket and a button-down shirt, for example. So those combinations seem so simple and so accustomed to us today. But at that time, that was not a situation where people naturally began to gravitate it. So we surveyed a number of companies and sent out about 25,000 guides to casual business wear to companies all over America. And the particular target at that time were top 100 businesses, companies that you would not expect to allow some form of casual dress in the workplace at that point. These tended to be older line manufacturing companies. And one of the first adopters was a company called Alcoa out of Pittsburgh. And when Alcoa began to allow casual business wear, that began the kind of cascade you would expect. It was one thing if Apple allowed casual business clothes in the heart of Silicon Valley. It was another thing if a mainline traditional company began to allow it. So that guide became something that was distributed within companies, posted on bulletin boards, shared with company correspondents to their employees. And oftentimes we found those same employees took those guides to their clothing store and said, here's what I want to look like. Can you help me? So you see this vehicle going into organizations, helping organizations, and then being given to employees who oftentimes men, but also women, would take this and look to match those types of appearances. So that's how the guide evolved, how it was used, and the benefits it really had at all levels, if you will, of that of the marketing funnel.
Well, that's interesting because one of the first episodes of this podcast that I did, we talked about an idea that you know the individual I'm going to mention, Edward Bernays. He was one of the founders of public relations, and he came up with the whole concept of bacon and eggs. And I spent an entire episode basically describing how he came up with working for the Beech Nut Company, which sold bacon, how they came up with the concept of bacon and eggs and how that should be part of an American heavy breakfast at the time. And the reason I bring that up now is because when I look at your strategy, when I look at your approach in 1992, it was not a whole lot different than what Edward Bernays did in the 1920s, and I'll tell you why. What he did with bacon and eggs was he did a survey of sorts. He wrote a letter to a large number of doctors in the United States, basically asking them, what do you consider a healthy breakfast for Americans? And they came back with the term heavy. And heavy was defined then by Edward Bernays. Well, a heavy breakfast would be bacon and eggs. And they sold that concept to doctors to get their endorsement. If you fast forward to 1992, when I look at what you did with Dockers was very similar to what Edward Bernays did, because he did a survey of doctors to basically make a change in American lifestyle, to convince Americans to do bacon and eggs breakfast. Now, in 1992, Levi's and your team and your whole marketing team, they did research. And at the end of the day, they came up with a print piece, a brochure that went out to HR directors instead of what Bernays used were doctors. But still, these are influencers. These were thought leaders at the time. How did you decide that human resource managers were the key?
Well, again, back to our friend, the good Mr. Bernays, we really wanted to understand how decisions were being made in organizations with regard to dress and appearance. And what we found during that period, too, was because of the recession, companies were having to cut benefits to employees and looking for options to retain their most valued workers. I know that is striking a chord for everyone right now in particular. And what they found and what we found and decided was that actually allowing employees to dress casually was a no-cost benefit for companies. That was well received by employees. The other thing that we found and was able to share is that some initial studies that were conducted in those times, in those years, also found that, shockingly, that productivity went up in organizations that allowed for a more casual or relaxed dress environment. So not only did you have the benefit of a no-cost perk for employees, but you did find quantitative data that supported an enhanced and more productive work environment. So those two things were very helpful to make the case for HR and benefits managers who were counseling their executives on things they could do within the organization to make it a better place to be.
Why do you think that improved productivity?
Well, this is just personal anecdote, but we think that part of the reason that productivity went up is that employees felt that they had more control over their own time and environments, and were having less restrictive things placed on them by management that really didn't affect the quality or thoughtfulness of their work. So loosening, and this is anecdotal, but loosening some of those restrictions sent the subtle signal that employees were valued for what they did as opposed to how they looked. And this was a way of being able to demonstrate that.
Well, one of the things that was so interesting about that is that HR managers became your sort of brand ambassadors. Do you think something like that could happen today?
Well, in some cases and in some ways, we think that versions of that are happening all the time. We see manifestations of that outside of organizations with quote unquote influencers who may recommend products or brands to people in the same way they would recommend other types of content. We found certainly that as companies begin to embrace certain types of activities or other things, one of the spaces that still is that point of communication apart from someone's intranet or apart from an email is indeed the company bulletin board or the elevator. And so those places continue to exist in terms of kind of sharing what management supports and what management allows folks to do. So there are subtle forms of endorsement that have always happened and continue to happen within organizations.
Do you remember any specific instances where you started to see the results of your work, when you started to see organizations like Alcoa go from suit and tie? And you mentioned Alcoa, and that is definitely an old line company, especially at that time. So they made a statement. But do you remember any other instances where you started to see it starting to take and you realized there was no turning back?
Well, one of our goals early on was to really focus on the top 100 employers nationally. And these would be folks outside of the tech industry and things. Remember, at that point, the tech industry was still somewhat in its embryonic stages. And while Silicon Valley and some of the biotech corridors were in place, they certainly didn't have the cachet that they do today. Once we found that through our first mailing and through our first set of requests, that 80 of the top 100 Fortune 500 companies had requested our information, we knew that we had not only touched a nerve, but we had and were offering something that they perceived as having value. And that as we began to see examples of that filtering into the workplace through requests for information, requests like where's product available, where can people in Pittsburgh go to find this, we knew those types of things were having that kind of direct relationship. Recall, too, at that point, we didn't have the kind of instantaneous information we have today in terms of downloads of the brochure, or what we may have done at that point was offer electronic coupons. But we certainly would look at incentives and let stores and folks like that know in those regions that this program was underway. And so the retail side of the business began to kick in with looking at point of sale and other things that reinforced that notion of casual business wear and looks and apparel that were appropriate for it. So you had a 1-2 punch there. Number one, let's get them at work. And number two, let's reinforce that when they shop or when their spouse or significant other may shop.
Rick, what role did you play specifically, individually on your team? Did you contribute anything creatively to what we now think as business casual?
I would like to think that I contributed a lot creatively, but like a good account leader, my contributions were probably more strategic and support for copy than necessarily a single idea that began to drive the campaign. We had a real collaborative relationship as an agency with our client at Levi's, and that included on our team both designers, graphic designers, as well as copywriters and account managers and media relations professionals. So we were kind of thinking of this program in a pretty holistic way to begin with, not just as a, quote, direct mail piece, but what are the earned media opportunities that could support it and help amplify it? What are the ways that we could get companies to demonstrate and talk about their events with their local media? So not only was there a kit that included the guide, but there were ideas on how they could implement it in the workplace. There were ideas on how they could promote their workplace to their communities as a great place to work. So we really tried to kind of create that groundswell, if you will, but emanating from a very credible source, and that was the company itself who was involved. On the client side, our direct client, while they happened to be working in the public relations area, had a real close working relationship with their marketing teams, but also with their retail and store teams. So all of us really worked together and shared and traded ideas here. But then my role was probably more strategy and review, as well as copy and copy editing, as opposed to saying, gosh, one thing was my idea. It really was a team.
Well, you mentioned earned media, and for our listeners that aren't familiar with public relations, that's basically publicity. So when we say earned media, we're talking about getting article placements in the newspapers at that time, in the radio, television, anywhere where there's media. I have a question for you, though, because so much of the focus was on Dockers, and more specifically, khaki pants. But women also were affected by the arrival of business casual. How did you guys on the team with Levi's and Dockers address the women?
And just to clarify, while we did have a lot of attention on Dockers, the Guide to Casual Business Wear also showed jeans. And we also talked about, being true to the parent, how jeans could be incorporated into a casual wardrobe. At the same time, we showed both male and female looks, because Dockers was introducing a line of women's product as well that included slacks, as well as shirts, sweaters, and even shoes. So you had kind of a full apparel line that worked for both men and women. And in this case, one of the changes that was happening is as women moved into having to wear a skirt or a dress to work, being able to wear slacks as an alternative was a very, very important step at that point as well. So both genders really were addressed here. What we found, at least from my perspective, is that women were much more fashion forward in general than men. I know that may be a surprise even today, but it was certainly the case for the average office worker back then.
Well, one of the interesting things that I learned when I was researching this episode was, now we know about the 8-page print piece that you sent out to the HR people, and you mentioned that was only one idea as part of a larger program. Dockers also sponsored in-office fashion shows, and they had a hotline for HR managers for what they called dress code emergencies. How would you define a dress code emergency?
Well, here's a very good example of a dress code emergency. It's when individuals in an office perhaps chose their own way to dress, and sometimes those choices really weren't consistent with the company's culture or the company's brand. And so oftentimes those emergencies came for express purposes of, are there examples you can provide us? Are there looks that you can share that we can pass along to our employees to show and give them help on what is acceptable and what may not be? So oftentimes we found employees were asking management for guidance here. And so we were really helping meet that need at times like this, and giving them a way to share examples without necessarily dictating what those examples were. And to be clear, no one said you have to buy Dockers. What they were saying was, here are examples of looks that we believe are appropriate as part of casual dress. And so that implied endorsement was very important then, as an implied endorsement is today.
Now, what about yourself? You guys were at the epicenter of this change to business casual. Did you start to see any trends within the team on what types of clothing people chose to wear and how they chose to implement business casual?
Well, in our particular case, within our office, and we were based in San Francisco, because we worked with companies like Levi Strauss and Apple and other firms in Silicon Valley, we already had a dress code in place that actually mirrored most business casual trends that evolved later. So we were very comfortable in our own environments. However, within our company and organization at that time, within the agency organization, that was the era when Ben still went to work in suits and ties, and women in dresses, and it was a much more formal environment. So within our own company, broadly, which was a global public relations firm, we were the odd ducks, and we were kind of the test lab. So we both took pride in that, but recognized that we always had a suit in the closet for men, because at the end of the day, just as it is today, you dress, if you're in a service business, you dress to be client appropriate and situation appropriate. And that's what we did then, and what I still do today.
Can you think of any ideas that someone came up with that didn't work out as part of business casual?
Boy, that's a good question. I'm just trying to rack my brain, Tim, for a minute to see what that might be like. I mean, we had a lot of, in that particular case, we had a lot of conversations around what those different looks might be. And they weren't necessarily, if I recall, exactly mirrored on what types of apparel was available from Levi's, but it was more what types of looks may be appropriate in the community. And recall that we were in an environment that even in the early 90s, we would see folks from Apple get up on stages at press conferences in Chicago and New York, and their engineers would be wearing plaid shorts, which was truly crazy at that point in time. So we looked at a range of options from, are shorts appropriate? Would short slacks be appropriate? What types of shirts are appropriate here? And so we really tried to find a middle ground to give individuals a range of looks that weren't too radical, but allowed, again, those mid-market companies to be able to identify and adapt. And that's why even at that point, the idea of wearing jeans in an office environment really was not something that was accepted, not even widely accepted. It wasn't accepted at all. So to be able to show a jean with a blazer and a shirt is a very sharp look. But that, for that point in time, was a big step forward. So again, we tried to find a balance between how to push the envelope, but also how to work within what we knew based on our conversations with HR directors and feedback we got from others, and even the kinds of questions that came in over the hotline. What were they hearing, and what was acceptable and what could work?
Well, I remember that time period pretty well. And during the 90s, I worked in a pretty large global agency and did a lot of travel. And we wore suits everywhere we went. And I can remember that time because around the time that this whole idea of a casual Friday came into be, that really confused all the people at the agency because of that point you made. When you might have to go meet with a client, do you go in your casual outfit or do you wear your suit? And so people in the senior level decided they err on the side of asking us to wear suits. And I can remember when it started to shift, because you would go to a client meeting with a suit on and none of your people on the client side had a suit on and you were overdressed. So that became one of those miscommunications. Do you remember having to address that with your marketing program and your educational program? How to basically create this etiquette that is around business casual for client meetings and those types of things?
Well, there are a group of industries, certainly the service industry and the agency, marketing, advertising agency business is part of that. So the whole service industry component of it was really different than, let's say, the office environment of a insurance company, where the vast majority of individuals never ventured outside the company or met with external clients. But we tried in the communication wherever we could. And that's really where that term came up. Situation appropriate became a way of saying, simply be prepared. You know, we want to give you the option to do this. Simply be prepared for the situation as it presents itself and use your good judgment. So moving that back to giving the employee the both right, but the responsibility to make good decisions showed that level of respect. And as we know, the world is built like a bell curve, so there are always going to be a group of employees who did not make good decisions, but the vast majority of them did. And oftentimes, if someone came to a meeting and they were really not dressed appropriately, they knew themselves. And oftentimes, we found from what we would hear and what we would see, it really wouldn't happen a second time in most cases.
Well, it must be surreal for you today, just when you look around, anytime you go to a meeting and you see the way people are dressed and you see just common lifestyle practices at work, and you can always look back and trace it to something that you worked on. How do you feel when you see the impact that your work has made on the way people dress at work?
It's one of those levels of satisfaction, I think, for not only myself, but everyone who had the opportunity to work on that program, that we were able to make a change that really provided benefits to everyone, including ourselves. And it also taught us a lot about what it takes to begin to change cultures and some of the fundamental basis around behavior change in a very real and practical way. I think that I never forget that. And you could say, well, in terms of changing the world, it's one thing and it's really nice. But these days, there are other things that are much more important. I think part of that became a basis for a little bit later in my career, getting more involved in behavior change from the standpoint of social change, and social change in the sense of how do we reduce tobacco use? How do we help people live healthier lifestyles? How can we get them to make good choices that not only benefit themselves, but obviously benefit others through better care, better health, and things like that? So I got very involved in some of those types of programs, but never forget the fundamental lessons that we've learned around that. But I got to tell you, again, just at that superficial level, if you will, I never forget for a moment going to a meeting, being able to be dressed in business casual clothes, and somebody else is still there in a suit, and feeling good that for most of us, it's just improved the day-to-day quality of life for those of us who are in office settings.
Well, you mentioned something a few minutes ago, and that was what you learned about creating social change and creating behavioral change. What do you think were the big lessons for you that you brought to other work that you did after that? If someone were to say to you that we want to make a societal change, and you had to rely on your experience with business casual, what did you learn there that you then would look to apply anywhere else?
Well, I think that there are probably three things that were really kind of hammered home to us then that have played through in other programs. And one is we look at kind of behavior change models, and they're kind of a three-legged stool, if you will. One part of that stool you might look at is cultural acceptance. Is there a way of gaining that kind of acceptance or support for that particular move or idea? Now, the second part of that is to look at, is this something that is within the means of the individuals that are involved? What's the cost of doing so, or lack of cost? In this case, you take it back to, well, this was kind of a cost-free benefit, but are the clothes that we're recommending something that are affordable? Is it something that you can do? And I think that the third part of this is, and this comes back to kind of behavior change around societal issues, is the enforcement part. And in this case, the enforcement part is not so onerous as legal enforcement, but it's enforcement in the sense of, think of that HR director and their responsibility for being able to provide a benefit, but also to enforce the parameters of how you can choose to exercise that benefit. So even in something as supposedly straightforward as adopting casual dress, you had all three of those factors in place, and a cultural embrace for being able to do so, even if it was an incentive. The second is the enforcement part of that, which are here's some guidelines on how you can implement this and what our expectations are of you. And then the third part of that is this something that is cost affordable? Can you be able to implement this within your situation? And if any of those are out of whack, the system doesn't work, or the adoption is much slower and not as broad. So those three principles, I think a lot of whenever we get involved in programs that are looking at creating change, particularly over the long term.
Well, one of the comparisons that you mentioned that I'd like to ask you about, and that is when we talk about business casual, it's really not a hard sell to convince people to want to not wear a suit to work, or if you're a female, not wear a high heels and a dress to work every day, mandatory. It's really not hard to convince people not to want that. But you mentioned tobacco. And when you talk about tobacco use, a lot of people who use tobacco don't want to necessarily quit. They may know rationally they should quit, but they don't really want to. So how do you convince people to want to do something?
Well, depending on the situation, we have two types of issues with regard to tobacco specifically, those individuals who have not started and those individuals who are already using. And the outreach to them and the messaging to each of those groups is very, very different on the part of that, because clearly it's not a matter of saying smoking or using chew or something is going to be harmful to your health. People know that it is. It's to give them an emotional reason why they should either not start or to stop. And the second thing is to provide the support tools for them to want to make that move, or in the case of people who have not started, to choose not to do it, to make it as simple as what we think today is buckling your seatbelt. The same thing is true there in terms of the choice not to use. So you get into a lot of discussions around what's causing certain behaviors and what's causing people to change those behaviors. And the same thing is really true in that model. Let's say it is people who are currently not using tobacco. The cultural acceptance is to demonstrate how people who take risks, those people who might be first to use tobacco at those points of initiation, are choosing not to do it. So how the popular kids are choosing not to use versus, if you remember back in a number of the movies, it was the either popular kids or the risk takers who were the ones to use, and they're the ones who led the crowds. The second part is the enforcement aspect. Is it possible to go to your store and buy if you're under 18? And so enforcement is very important there too. And the third element there is cost. And as taxes increase and costs go up, it's not nearly as affordable to participate. So all of those things in that particular application blend in, but blend in different ways.
Well, you mentioned peer pressure in a sense, and there is nothing more persuasive than peer pressure.
And role modeling, and true, and it's very true. So if you are able to identify individuals who can role model choosing not to participate for some reason, whether it's because they are being lied to by big tobacco or whatever it might be, finding that hook for them is what becomes important. Not necessarily or telling them, hey, this is going to hurt you, because let's face it, when you're that age, you think you're going to live forever. And the fact is, tobacco isn't going to kill you tomorrow, and you have many other things in your life. So there needs to be other reasons why. And with many of the national campaigns, that balance of creating cultural acceptance for not using, combined with these other activities, has been shown to be effective at reducing use. Once one of those things stops, let's say the campaign goes dark, there's very clear empirical evidence that use starts going right back up because one of those factors is missing. And that's the troublesome part when you get into eras where we may be entering a recession and programs for tobacco reduction stop, use goes up, and we're just kicking it down the road and paying those bills later.
Well, we've talked about tobacco, and we've also talked about business casual. And there is that common thread, and that is that we are talking about the behavior of a society and how that changes. And it can come in big ways and important ways like tobacco use, and it also can come in other ways where we talk about fashion. So getting back to the fashion, and I just have one final question for you. What do you think, Rick, is the future of the suit?
I think, like many things, Tim, the suit will come back as being something that individuals want to wear more often and want to accessorize with. In fact, I see it in my own son, who absolutely enjoys dressing up. He enjoys wearing a suit. He enjoys looking good. But make no mistake, I think the era of the suit as a required piece of business dress is long past us for many people, because also one of the things that we began to find is that once you incorporate casual dress into a work environment or accept it, it's almost impossible to go the other direction. And not least of which is the cost to tell people and your staff, okay, you all need to go out and buy suits and shirts and ties and better shoes before you can come into work. So we talked earlier about incentives, no-cost incentives that reinforce we value what you do, not what you look like. And I don't think that premise has changed. So I think the suit will have its day again, but not in the way we knew it.
Rick, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, for talking about business casual and also talking about your work on the tobacco issue.
Well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate that. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you as well. And just from the point of relevance, what we've all been experiencing and will continue to experience in some of the coming months, this notion that we see play out every day around behavior and behavior change is really evident in front of us. And those who choose to voluntarily accept this notion of social distancing and the benefits it can have, how we think about others, and the implications with regard to cost and enforcement. So all of those three factors are in play for us today on a very important issue that all of us are and can help support. And so I just hope and wish that everyone who is in our marketing communities knows and understands and shares those same beliefs with others. And if so, we can get back to these high-level worries about what we're wearing and what we're doing, and not about everything that's driving us at the moment. So thank you for the time today, and look forward to talking to you again very soon.
To learn more about Rick Miller and everything we talked about today, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please help others find it. Leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.